years, there may have been maybe a couple of hundred deaths on ecstasy, maybe. There have been hundreds of thousands of deaths on alcohol.
Yeah, but I mean, obviously, many more people consume alcohol than take ecstasy.
Pro rata. Well, no, I would say pro rata, probably alcohol is more dangerous than ecstasy. I've argued that for some time, yes. It may be useful for the treatment of disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder. Because what ecstasy seems to do psychologically is allow people to talk about emotional experiences, the trauma, for instance, of being blown up in Afghanistan, without such an enormous emotional response that the brain shuts down. So normally, in order to deal with trauma, people have to relive it and then get a cognitive control over it. That's the current way in which the treatment of PTSD works. But for many people who've been severely traumatized, as soon as the memory of the trauma comes into consciousness, they dissociate. They cannot engage with it. Therefore, they cannot control it. And we believe that MDMA is potentially a very good drug for helping people get the memory and still be able to control, because it dampens down the emotional response to the memory. So those trials are ongoing in clinical practice, and one of them is already reported and looks quite good. What I want to know is what's going on in the brain. Where is that effect of ecstasy to control emotions happening?
And do you run the risk of being accused of sensationalism by doing this on TV? You know there's going to be criticism.
Well, I hope
this
not.
Isn't the way that scientific research should be conducted.
I've already been called the raving loony professor in the Standard, but it is. I mean, you say it isn't the way it should be conducted, and I would say to you that this is the only way I have been able to do this study. No one else was funding it. Channel 4 agreed to fund it. This is a serious documentary on the science of MDMA. It isn't just about our experiment. It's about the broader issues, the issues of benefits, the issues of harms. They'll all be properly evaluated.
Do you think this work on magic mushrooms and ecstasy could mark a shift in psychiatry? That there'll be a new generation of these kinds of drug treatments in the future?
I hope so. I think psychiatry is already beginning to undergo a paradigm shift in how we think about treatments. Up till now, we've tended to think that there are two kinds of treatments. There's drug treatments, which you take every day, and there are psychological treatments which cure you, hopefully cure you. The future is going to be using drugs to optimize psychological treatments. And we've got our experiments with psilocybin, and I think the way forward would be to use drugs to significantly enhance the other brain process which is necessary for recovery. And that will need a big change in the way the pharmaceutical industry views its role, because it isn't taking a pill every day. It's taking a powerful medicine intermittently, usually or probably alongside psychotherapy, in order to produce a profound change in brain function, which then is enduring.
Have you personally been criticised as a research scientist for wanting to work in this area? I mean, it is controversial.
Well, yeah, I mean, certainly I've been vilified by lots of newspapers. The Sun calls me Professor Poison. The Standard last week called me the raving loony professor. Illegal drugs are supposedly illegal because they're harmful. And I would certainly want to say that if you're in any way in which we're determining harms, we've always got to look at the other side of the equation, which is the possible benefits. And what we mustn't do is allow relatively small harms to deny the benefits, which could be enormous to a lot of people.
And is that your main motivation for wanting to work in this area? Because
yes, absolutely. I think there are intrinsic issues about understanding harms and trying to have a rational drugs policy based around harms. But fundamentally, what I want to do is use scientific knowledge to optimize benefits.
But I'd like to talk to you, David, about other areas where you've been involved in controversy. In 2009, you were chair of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs, the ACMD, the body that advises government about drugs and their classification based on how harmful they are. In October that year, you were sacked from this role for your criticism of the government's decision to reclassify cannabis from a Class C drug to the more harmful Class B category. And Earlier that year, an article you wrote was published in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, comparing the dangers of taking the drug ecstasy with the dangers of horse riding. You took part in a debate on the PM programme on Radio 4 with David Rains from the National Drug Prevention Alliance.
I think this is almost an April Fool joke. If we were to compare the harm of horse riding with, for instance, tobacco and alcohol, where the harms of those two substances are well known and they're absolutely massive in our society, you can see that the argument would be nonsense. Yes, of course, some people are injured by horse riding. Some people are injured while riding a bicycle. Most people are not addicted in the same way to horse riding as people get addicted to drugs. But more importantly for me is I'm concerned about Professor Nutt espousing this cause. I mean, he is the chairman of the Advisory Council on the Misuse of Drugs. So, of course, people are going to pay attention when he speaks. Now, I don't object to him having an individual strong view about these things, but I think if his view contradicts his position on the ACMD, he shouldn't be on the ACMD.
Fair criticism?
Well, not at all. I mean, it was fascinating what he said there, because, of course, you wouldn't even need to make the argument that alcohol is more dangerous than horse riding, because he made it for me. Now, as was the chair of the scientific committee of the ACMD and then chair of council, I had to fulfil the role of the ACMD, which is providing the best evidence base for decisions relating to the classification of drugs. And it seems to me, and it has, because I worked there for 10 years before I was sacked, a lot of what I tried to do in that role was develop a systematic way of assessing the harms of different drugs, and at the same time try to put those absolute harms into some kind of perspective beyond the drug arena. And the horse riding incident is a fascinating one, because it actually came out of a patient of mine. I saw a patient who was in her 30s, suffered brain damage from falling off a horse. She'd lost her job, her marriage, her children, and that was because the brain damage had changed her personality, and that was irretrievable. And it got me thinking, how harmful is horse riding? And I discovered it's actually pretty harmful. Horse riding is clearly, for some people, addictive. There are people who ride horses who can't stop riding horses. So I just invented this term, equine addiction syndrome, to essentially engage the public in a thought experiment about the relative harms of these two addictions.
But I guess, ultimately, surely the issue that people would have is that horse riding is legal and ecstasy is not.
Yes, but of course ecstasy was legal until 1980s. And this was let me just share with you this fascinating conversation I had with the Home Secretary. That paper was published and immediately became, very hot news.
So this was where Jackie Smith...
And then Jackie Smith rang me up, and she rang me up and said I was wrong to have published the paper, because it wasn't a scientific paper. It was essentially a piece of policy, and I'm not allowed as a scientist on the ACMD to get involved in policy. And I said to her, look, if you're going to make drugs illegal, because at that time we were discussing making GHB illegal, BZP illegal, you've got to have some external metric. You can't do it simply in the bubble of drugs. And harms from horse riding are, an interesting comparator. And she said, no, you can't do that, because one's illegal and one's not illegal. And I said, you've got to do it, because otherwise making things illegal is going to be arbitrary. But it was very difficult to get politicians to understand that. But then it got me thinking, look, that's one even more important reason why you don't make things illegal, because as soon as they are illegal, people stop thinking. And people like me can't research them, or it's much harder for us to do that. So there's an even greater reason for having a very, very clear decision-making process on whether something's illegal or not. And we've got to use the best evidence. We can't simply let politicians do it.
Jumping forward to October 2009, when you were sacked from your role as government drugs czar, many politicians across all parties, I think, were very critical, saying that it wasn't your job as chair of this government committee to criticise policy.
My job is not to criticise policy. My job is to defend science. And when politicians are using bad science to justify policy, then I must stand up. And the absurd example was when Alan Johnson, when he sacked me, he said, the ACMD have told us that cannabis does not cause schizophrenia. And we said it mostly doesn't. However, he said, I met a prison governor last week who told me categorically that it did. Now, if you are prepared to say that a prison governor has better insight into the science of cannabis than the 30-person ACMD that has spent 7 years working it, that's an insult to science. And that, you can understand why I was angry.
Do you have any regrets now about what happened in 2009?
Not at all, no. I mean, in fact, paradoxically, what's happened is that I've set up this independent scientific committee on drugs. Most of the scientists on the ACMD resigned when I was sacked, so they have joined my new committee. We now have a truly independent voice about drugs. I think our committee now is the only truly independent source of information about drugs in the world. We don't have any biases from government, and we don't have any biases from drug users. We truly do present the truth about drugs. And what's happened is that now the media come to us for information about drugs. They don't go to the ACMD because they see that as essentially tarnished by being so close to government.
Has anyone from government ever approached your committee for advice?
Yes.
Too sensitive an issue at the moment?
I think it would be fair to say the Home Office have approached us on occasions to help them deal with some of the complexities around the chemistry of some of the drugs that they are controlling, although that's been informal.
Will we ever cure the drugs problem? And don't those who are involved in trying to solve it have a kind of poison chalice, whether they're scientists or politicians?
That's a very interesting question, and I suppose we need to understand what you mean by the drugs problem. Do you mean drug addiction, or do you mean drug use? We have to rethink the way we control all drugs. We have to, I think, have an overarching act, like many countries do. They have they put all drugs into a drug, so alcohol comes into some kind of act which would be an extension of something like the Medicines Act. We have to accept that drugs are drugs. Decisions we make about drugs should be based on their harms. And then we should use that knowledge to minimise the harms of all drugs, including alcohol and tobacco, and maximise the benefits.
David Nutt, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Jim.